Muy buenas tardes, señoras y señores. Nos reunimos esta tarde en torno a una nueva sesión de nuestro formato Diálogos Cosmopolitas, en el que, como ustedes saben, invitamos a destacadas figuras de diversos ámbitos de la cultura internacional para que compartan con nosotros su trayectoria. Esta tarde tenemos el honor de recibir al profesor Robin Lane Fox, quien dialogará con David Mejía, profesor de filosofía en CUNEF Universidad. Como es habitual en este formato, las sesiones se desarrollan en inglés. Además, ofrecemos a modo de apoyo un subtitulado orientativo en español generado mediante inteligencia artificial. No detallaré en profundidad la trayectoria de nuestro invitado, ya que este es el propósito de esta sesión. Sin embargo, de forma muy breve, destacaré que fue profesor de Historia Antigua en la Universidad de Oxford hasta 2014 y actualmente es Fellow emérito del New College de Oxford. Es también colaborador habitual del Financial Times. Varios de sus ensayos han sido traducidos al español, entre ellos Alejandro Magno, conquistador del mundo, el mundo clásico, la epopeya de Grecia y Roma y el más reciente, publicado hace solo unos días, Homero y su Ilíada. Y para concluir, permítanme dar nuestra bienvenida a nuestro invitado en su idioma, Professor Robin Lane Fox. Welcome to Madrid. Welcome to the Juan March Foundation. We are delighted to have you with us. Many thanks. Gracias.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this new chapter of Cosmopolitan Dialogues here at the Fundación Juan Mar. Today we are honored to welcome Professor Robin Lane Fox. Professor Fox, thank you very much for being with us here tonight.
Oh, thank all of you. Yeah.
Robin Lane Fox is a historian, a classicist, a writer, known for his profound contributions to our understanding of Asian history, and particularly ancient Greece and Rome. With a distinguished academic career at Oxford University and so many influential books, Robin Lane Fox has inspired readers worldwide. We thank you for that. And his work not only explores the historical events of ancient times, but also delves into the cultural, philosophical, and religious facets that shaped these civilizations. We'll be discussing his career, his approach to classical history and classical texts, and his perspectives on the relevance of Asian history in modern times. Hope we have time for at least half of this. Well, it is my understanding that you read Homer for the first time while you were a student here at Eton College.
Oh.
Here you have, right there.
I got it, yeah, well, I never.
And can you tell us about what this experience meant to you, this first encounter with the Iliad?
Do you want it all?
We want it all.
We were all men, boys. Some of us were little boys and some were big boys, you can imagine. Well, I was so brilliantly educated. How lucky I was. I was one of the scholars. You take a very important exam from all over the country to see if you can get a scholarship. And I had no idea whether I was good or bad or whatever. But I did discover, to my terror, that half of the last paper would be about science. We'd never done any science. So I thought, well, that's it. But I think that Zeus was watching. One of the questions was, write short notes on this, that, and the other. And one of the things they asked for short notes was a type of vegetable, brassica. I, since the age of 10, had been a very, very seriously keen gardener. So I wrote book after book of things fast, telling them how to grow cabbage, how to grow it in the spring, how to make it germinate, how best to eat it with orange. They were astonished. They thought this was not the scientific account of the plant, but they couldn't argue with it, because unlike them, I really knew cabbage. So I got a scholarship. But then there is a choice. Do you go and live with all the other scholars? If you look at the picture, you'd be living in the building on the left. which is a sort of inhuman kind of English institution. You live in an open dormitory, and you are all working as hard as you can. You just have a curtain. And we all outside, the scholars would say they all got into bed together, and God knows what happened. Or do you pay the money and you go to a house? And my mother said, because my family have always been to this school, Robin cannot go in with the scholars, otherwise he will end up wearing spectacles. This was a wonderful remark. So it cost quite a bit of money. I went in with all the boys in other houses where you're outside the main scholar. And of course they are not so clever. They were very athletic, and they thought I was really, as I probably am, very strange. But it was very good for me. I learned not to be my head in the clouds. And I really competed against the scholars. They were all there together in a group, and I was outside. So I had to do it all myself, including all the difficult subjects, maths, physics, no good at that, and languages, I could do that, and of course Greek and Latin. But I owe an enormous debt to Eton College. You read stuff in the newspapers as if they're a load of privileged people with their noses in the air. Well, what did I do when I eventually finished from the top of the school? I became a gardener in Germany, working in a public garden. Well, that isn't what is normally thought of Etonians. You can't generalize about us, but we were so lucky. We were so well taught.
And how was this first contact with the Iliad?
Well, okay, I can tell you, I said wonderful one remembers, I was 13 and a quarter, and it was my second term, the most difficult. And we had a very stern master called Tiger. And Tiger taught us the 6th book of the Iliad. At the same time, we were playing football. We weren't playing Etonian football, because of course Eton has a game of football completely different to Real Madrid. They would never win. We're too good at it. But we also have normal soccer. I longed to be good at football. So I was covered in earth. I remember looking at my hands and thinking, I've got earth stains all over my fingers, and I've now got to read this Greek poem. Amazingly, I preferred the Greek poem to soccer, and I read on. And I realized how lucky it was book 6, that this is no normal work of poetry, or it's not by some Frenchman. This is unsurpassed. And even at 13, I loved it. So I learned bits of it. And we had to learn by heart. Very good thing. And I learned the famous simile that as are the generations of leaves in the forest, and how they come and go when the seasons change, and in spring they grow again, so the generations of men, one comes, one falls. I remember this so much now in older age. And then we had to write Greek. We had to translate English into Greek, even parts of the newspaper. And later, when I got on, I had to write hexameter Greek like Homer. Think of it, amazing. Did I have any understanding of Spain? No. Did I ever hear it mentioned? I don't think so. My aunt bought a house somewhere near Malaga, but it wasn't classical to my mind. How ignorant we were. Did we hear about the history of Ireland? No, certainly not. But my God, we knew Greek and Latin.
That was your first contact with the Iliad, and it is also the motive of your last book. What made you return? This is, we see here the Spanish version and the original English version.
Yeah, lovely.
And what made you return to the Iliad at this point?
What a good question. I hadn't paid my electricity bill, and it was lockdown. And I was living on my own with the rabbits and a few animals in the garden. I have a big garden. And I went at last, I was allowed to go out to lunch with a friend who's a famous publisher, who said to me, Robin, you should write a book on Homer. if you do, I will pay you a sum of money, which I realized would pay my electricity bill. So I went back and thought, well, you know, I'm locked up. I can't see my family. I can't see my sweethearts. I can't see my grandson. I'm going mad. I will just write a book on Homer's Iliad, and I'll do it in 3 months. Apollo was watching, and he taught me for my hubris and conceit. And what began as 3 months took me nearly 3 years. But it made me say, I think, 2 things in life. We don't know, I can't tell you the answer, who probably Homer was and how he probably composed. But I give you, I hope, a good sense of the arguments and when. And there is much, I think, that has been really wrong, written by perhaps sometimes younger people who haven't read the poem for obviously so long, and they're wrong. Then the second part, I wanted to call it, Why Does the Iliad Make Me Cry? But the publisher said, you can't call it that. You'll be an object of ridicule. So you must explain. And then my son, who is also very shrewd, said, well, look, you must write about the highlights in the poem. We can't all read the whole poem. What a clever man he is. Tell us the bits you like best. Begin that. So I wrote, it was very difficult, 2 chapters on the books I love most and why. And then I really got to it. And I hope I tell you why the poem makes me cry. When the book came out in England, I had some very touching emails. And I prized 2. I've never met the people. One was a woman who said she had given up her job, and she was now, age 40, going to learn Homeric Greek because she knew what she was missing. Wonderful. Best thing she could do. I'm not sure what the job was. I was very happy with that. And the second was the woman, in an ideal way I'd had in mind when I write. If you write books, you must always think of an ideal person. And my person was this. It's so odd. I thought, well, it may not be a success in my lifetime, but if we go on about 50 years, books will have become rarities. And I imagine a very good-looking young lady with a rather awful boyfriend, and she doesn't know what to do with the boyfriend. And they're walking around in London, and on a table, they see some books for sale. We've now joined the Chinese currency in England. We've been forced not to join the euro, but the renminbi. So she pays a few renminbi, and she takes home a book called Homer and his Iliad. And it's very cold in London because we can't afford any more to heat the flats. And she's wearing sort of drab trousers that people wear as a soldier, really. And she tucks her legs under her on the sofa, and she starts reading. And the boyfriend gets restive because he wants dinner, but she goes on reading. And then he gets quite cross. And then he says, let's go to bed together, and she continues reading. So he gets into bed, and she doesn't go to bed with him. And then at 2 in the morning, she shuts the book, having finished it, and she says, God, I wish I had known him. This kept me going. Do you know the most extraordinary thing? A month after I wrote it, I got an email from a lady I'd never known, almost describing that circumstance. And the end of my imagination was she then dismissed the boyfriend. And she had done exactly that. This is wonderful. I haven't written for nobody.
When you say the Iliad makes you cry, does the story make you cry, or does the language make you cry?
Both. You can't split them. I've got a good question. I try not to. I tell you, look, there's no point in this lovely evening unless I speak a bit personally. I could give you, sort of boring facts. They're in the book. In Oxford, I do, for my undergraduate students, the prince and princesses of the universe, what was done for me as a schoolboy. I take the Greek text, they have the Greek text, and I translate for them, straight off, because I know it well. I want to show them you can. And we choose my 8 best books. Okay, we get to book 6 in the 3rd week, And I say, look, we've done book 1 and book 3. And I say, look, I'm very sorry. This is very hard for me to do. And I almost certainly will cry. Now, I have to admit that, as you perhaps don't realize, I'm actually 26. But in fact, I'm 78. And these people are 18 or 20. It must be very embarrassing. So on we go, and Hector meets Andromache. And for the last 200 lines of this book, we rise to a level never matched ever again, except, I think, in other parts of the Iliad. So I couldn't help it, because I see so much of my own life and people I've known behind these figures. And I cried. And of course, like you, they were very embarrassed. Okay. So I said, well, I'm so sorry, I'm afraid I can't help it. I was still crying. It doesn't stop, it gets worse every time I read it. So I said, well, we'll do book 9 next. And it's got the great speech when Achilles, wonderful, with a great sort of Spanish nobility, refuses the presents that he's being offered. I adored this as a young man. And this time, I'm afraid, I cried again. But no, there were 3 clever young ladies in the room, and they had brought a box of paper handkerchiefs. This was very kind of them. And they said afterwards, could they bring their friends now? We were doing this at night, at 8:30 after dinner. So I said, of course. So then we had up to 20 people, and we got to the last 2 books, the last 2 weeks. And we did, oh God, the death of Hector, and Andromache warming the water for his bath, unaware that he was lying dead on the battlefield. And then we do the final book, which is really a miracle. And this time, I warned them that I was going to cry, and they all cried. And we stopped at the end, and there was a great torrent of weeping. None of us could speak. It wasn't because of me, it was because of Homer. And the night had fallen outside, and there were a few stars in the sky. And I said to them, all right, go. The world will never see the same again. And that was 5 years ago. They send me Christmas cards still, and most of them put on the bottom. I didn't know some of the 20. Some of them, I'm afraid, were boyfriends and girlfriends and all that stuff. The world never seems the same. Thank you.
Well, I think this deserves a hand.
Sorry, that's not applause for me. That's, I hope, applause for Homer. Look, it's completely amazing. I'll give you an example, if I may. At least, in my view, we are 2,760 years ago, when Homer first performs with no text. He composes as he goes along this marvelous poem. Okay. It's a long time ago. You know, they were perhaps not very sophisticated, you think. This is all rather silly. This boy liked it at school. He's never grown up. Okay. Here are the 4 words from the Iliad that are hardly believable. I pot en. The characters say it on 4 or 5 occasions in their speeches. They are in this dreadful war. They've left their families. Helen has run away with Paris, who's a ghastly man, and she's stuck with him, and they are living in a nightmare. And sometimes they will reflect, I pot en, if at least it was ever really so. When they look back on their past, when they knew other people, when they were young, when others were alive, when they remember being happy with no war. Oh, for God's sake. They have this extraordinary consciousness that there is a past, and this, you know the feeling, the older ones. You rub your eyes and think, God, was that really true at the time? They're 2,700 years ago, and Homer has got it exactly, and he's got it in 4 short words, which you will never, I hope, ever forget. Priam thinks it's Helen, who's run away with a handsome man who turns out to be a sort of hopeless kind of celeb. And she says, and in the past, he was my brother-in-law, another one in Greece, if ever it was really so. Oh, Now, this is important to me. You can read all the wonderful heroic poems around the world. You can read, in my case, in translation, the poems of the Babylonian horrible hero Gilgamesh, ghastly man. It's all very dramatic and touching and wonderful. This is years ago. There is no hint of that self-awareness or reflection on what it means to be a person. It's unique to the Greeks. And Homer is a genius. I say in the book, for me, Homer invented epic, not just heroic poems where one thing follows another, a bit like Star Wars. That's not a real epic. He invents a plot. The Iliad is a long book. The action happens amazingly in 5 main days. And it has got a directed end to it, a movement from anger, emotion, to pity. On the way through, he invents and presents for the first time robots, long before Elon Ruddy Musk and his lot. He thought of it all. And he produces artificial intelligence, statues that can speak, being made by the supreme craftsman of the gods, by Hephaestus, not by some American engineer. And also, just to make sure that we realize he is a genius, he invents moving pictures. For the first time, we look over and we see the craftsman god sculpting on metal scenes of everyday life. And you can't, in metal, show a story. But Homer narrates it as if it is a sequence of moving pictures in a film. And the more I read, the more I feel that Homer had invented film, camera work, cutting, interrelating episodes before film existed.
Since we're speaking about film, I wanted to ask you what you think about this adaptation.
Oh, Christ. It's one of the most ghastly films I think I've ever seen. Astyanax, the baby, is pretty awful. A wonderful comment by a critic, Helen, the face that launched 1,000 face creams. And then at the end, I mean, come on, this is one of the greatest things in our world. Old Father Priam goes defenseless, out alone, into the camp by night to try to get back the body of his son Hector, whom Achilles has killed in a duel. And what is going to happen? He comes into the tent. I can't describe it because I'm afraid I will cry. Anyway, he kneels in front of Achilles. I will try what I can do. And he kisses the hands that had killed his son and asks him for the return of the body. What will Achilles do? He might have killed him. It's as if, take a random modern example, Zelensky had gone to Putin. Or Putin will put him in chains. Or kill him, give him Novichok. No. Achilles pushes him away gently, and they both start weeping. Priam weeps for the loss of his son Hector, and Achilles is made also by the sight of it to weep for his own father, whom he knows he will never see again, and his beloved Patroclus, who has died in battle. Well, what a scene. What happens in this frightful movie? Peter O'Toole arrives, probably drunk. He's probably been paid £500,000 for a 2-minute appearance. And he appears in the doorway wearing a sort of blanket and says, "Please, may I have my son back?" and walks out again. It's truly dreadful. And there we are. I can't say more than that.
I'd like to go back real quick to the question of authorship with the Iliad. Well, you have mentioned that Homer was a genius. Mm-hmm. You've said that he performed the Iliad. He didn't write it because your thesis is that he was illiterate, that he could not read or write.
Yeah.
It's just magnificent that the the father of Western literature
No,
was
he wasn't.
literature.
Yeah.
So the idea is that he performed, and one of these performances was recorded on writing.
Yeah, you've got it. This is what I want you all to realize. We are all people, like Homer. If we started early and we were well taught, we could do something. We couldn't do the Iliad, but we could do this. We can't now because we've got Facebook, we've got ghastly films like Troy, and we're lazy. Right. Homer doesn't memorize. This is so important. This is perhaps the most important point I want to make in the first part of the book. There is no text. He composes as he goes along. And this is possible because people traveling into other cultures around the world, whether it's in India or in my case in Central Asia, you encounter poets who cannot read or write, and they compose as they go forwards and go along. So I think, we can't know, I'm not alone in thinking this, but it's not been popular lately, that Homer eventually dictated a version of the Iliad for posterity. I like to think he did it because there would be a living in it for his children. Natural thing. We don't know if Homer married. Was he gay? I don't know. But I assume there was Mrs. Homer. I would love to spend the night with her, asking her questions, of course. And I think that he dictated it so his children could use it. But there have been previous performances, perhaps slightly different. I cannot believe there was a better one. But no, he cannot read, he cannot write. But at that time, writing, alphabetic quick writing, is beginning again in Greece. And somebody, being me, I like to think his daughter, well, we can't know, maybe slaves, take down the poem just as field workers in India or in Russia or in Kyrgyzstan, where I've been to hear it, take down the oral poems of singers quickly as they're going along. And this is basically our text with a few additions. Now, I'm not alone in that, but I am quite against the whole current of study in America. But I may not be completely against it. Amazing thing sent to me today. We are all in shock, of course, about the presidential election. And we think of the poor first lady. Well, what about the second lady? Vance's wife, Usha. Is she Indian? I think possibly. And there is a long newspaper article saying, what has Usha been reading? She's taken one and only one book with her on the campaign trail, the Iliad, and that is what she is reading, and she's now finished it. So Americans still love the poem. They'll all read it now because of her, but they don't understand the poet. They have, I think, an impossible view. It's been a muddle for years, that it evolved bit by bit over 300 years. One singer sang a bit, and another one added more, and then it became a bit longer, and eventually somebody, you can call him Homer if you want, pulled all the little bits together into a poem we now have. Nonsense. There is one guiding mind showing us how it's going to develop bit by bit on the way through.
Why is this so important to you as a reader? So the fact that, so the work is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Why, and of course, this is something that I want to believe as well in the individual genius, but does it make a difference for you as a reader to know that there's one single directing mind?
Right, well, this is a very good question. Now, I'm a historian, so we want to know. But there is one thing. Homer is reciting, and he is presenting it as he goes along. And this is another thing I really think never said. Perhaps he sang at the beginning, and if somebody is singing a song in the poem, he would have sung it with his lyre. I don't think, some do, that he sang the whole poem. It would go too slowly. But I am sure that he performed it with gesture and with engagement. He is the world's first performing actor. This is so important. People don't think of it. He has no mask like the actors in tragedy, long before Greek drama. Homer has performed the thing. He's spoken a little like Aphrodite to catch the audience's attention. He's moved his arms as I do. And when you are, perhaps, I hope you will, of course, abandon your job, your boyfriends, your husbands and wives, and go and learn ancient Greek. And when you have and you read it through, you must read it out loud, thinking of it as a performance. And if you want to see what could be involved, I give it in the book. I really recommend it. The singers in Central Asia who sing the even longer, huge poems composed with no text about the hero Manas, they are online in films made in the 50s and 60s by Russians. And you are as near there, I think, to Homer's performance and audience. I can't understand a word, but you can't but watch it, amazed, 5 or 10 minutes of it. So it helps you that. But of course, when I first read the poem, I had no idea. I was just reading a text. I didn't worry about this. It's not necessary. But if you think of Homer performing, it multiplies your amazement.
The Iliad is one of the greatest artistic accomplishments of humanity, but it's not taught in schools. How do you feel about this? It is not taught in schools, so children are not exposed to it.
This is appalling. This is the most terrible thing. This is going to be put right in Spain. I think, I'm serious, of all the people in Europe, I feel that the people of Spain are most placed to appreciate it. You have lived in this country through terrible, awful times, as bad as the fall of Troy in the previous generation. Homer is telling a story of men who are not as men are nowadays. They're looking back, as you can, to the 30s, awful. That's one. Two, there is still an idea of nobility and being a man. I'm afraid, women, not so easy for you, but it's not always easy to be a woman in Homer either. And there are the values of courtesy and generosity and even kindness, but a strong sense of noble manhood. And of course, like me, many of you, and the rest of you know you should, love horses. And of course, the heroes love their horses. I did have a chapter called Women and Horses, but the American publisher said, we really cannot do this, Robin. You cannot put the two. And the whole point was they loved the horses more than the women. But this was not allowed, so we've had to change that. But I just want you to know that I know that many Spaniards enter into this. And I do think, oh, for heaven's sake, you know, Frenchmen, can you imagine a French man as a Homeric hero? You must be joking. And Italians are completely wonderful, but they're like the birds in a simile. But here in Spain, it comes home to you. And I hope that all I can most hope is that you will understand through my book what it is that means so much still. You can see, to me, I must have read it 50 times. I don't do this normally, but it is so powerful to me, and it will catch you too. And then I will say, you have not lived for nothing.
Is it possible to enjoy the Iliad in that passionate, profound way, reading a translation?
The excellent question. Here is what I learned from a colleague who is the world expert on Tolstoy. My other hero. Right. Tolstoy kept a notebook when he read, and he had several headings. One was great, the other was very good, the next was good, and the next was bad, middling, and then bad. Okay. And as a young man, he read Homer's Iliad. And to my horror, he put it in the category, very good. But he then learned Greek. And my friend tells me he crossed out very good, and he put a line up and put the Iliad at the top of the list of great. That is the difference. You'll think it's very good when you read it, I hope. But if you read Greek, you won't even argue. It's a miracle. And we love the Odyssey, of course.
Okay, let's go back to young Robin Lane Fox.
Oh, my God. If it ever was really so, oh yeah, here you have it. Yeah.
Is it true that you were 15 when you started working on the biography?
No, I was about 17.
17?
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
very
I'm so
old
sorry.
then.
Yeah. Yeah, I finished it when I was just, I had just been 20, I've got to get this right, 26 and a bit. And my daughter had just been born, and it nearly killed me. But I did it. I never thought I would do another.
What, I mean, Alexander was himself an admirer of the Iliad, right?
That's it.
And is that the connection?
That is one of the basic things that pulled me in. And it has gone on developing. Alexander, his hero was Achilles. And it went very deep. I hope I show it in the book. And he kept the special text that Aristotle, think of it, his tutor, edited for him in the most precious casket that he captured from the Persian king. This wasn't just some kind of publicity. No, if I may, I'll give a personal example. You perhaps remember the first Gulf War, when we invaded and pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I was amazed to discover, people sent me the link, that the great general, Norman, do you remember the American generals? Was he Norman Schwarzkopf, I think? Gave a press conference, and on the table in front of him was my book on Alexander. Oh. Well, I thought, wonderful. But then I discovered that one of my former pupils had been serving on his staff, and they had said in a hurry, quick, the cameras are coming, we must have a book. It must seem as though the general reads. So they'd put Alexander on the table. But for Alexander the Great, Homer was something far more. And the point I wanted to bring out, and it's become more and more clear the more we know, and I'll just say something I hope to fascinate you. Ancient Macedon, in which he grew up, in so many ways had a close relationship to what he could read in the Iliad. It wasn't some random fantasy. I think that Ferdinand and Isabella here had a fascination with the chivalrous stories of early medieval Spain because they were living with them. It was real to them. Well, since I wrote, we found many, many things. The tomb of his father Philip, the palace of King Philip. Unbelievable that this should all appear, I have to say, where I said it would be in the first chapter, and everyone said I was mad, but it was. And we realized that the funerals for the members of the royal family were very similar to the funerals of the Homeric heroes. Same cremations. Amazing. So it comes home to him. Now, the point I want to say is this. 3 weeks ago, the Greek Archaeological Service, can you imagine this in my lifetime, started to excavate what I, and especially the great Greek archaeologist, Angeliki Kotoridis, are quite clear is the real school where Aristotle, the cleverest man in the world, taught Alexander the Great and his companions. We've got it, we've got the ground plan. They're digging it now. Oh God, what are they going to find? Alexander's school marks, or a message to him saying, Alexander, I love you always, Hephaestion. I don't know, but can you imagine that would come true in your own lifetime? It doesn't get better.
Well, here,
well,
this is an important part of your life as well, right?
Of course it is, yeah. But it just arrived in my life, which was already, as you can see, Alexander, Homer, the world, you know.
And this is you.
Yeah, of course it is.
This is you with Oliver Stone, the director.
Yes, it is.
And with Colin Farrell, the actor who plays Alexander.
I was telling Colin Farrell how to act. Probably how to ride. He was marvelous. Yeah.
I like your hand. You seem to have, doing this.
I'm showing how to hold a spear. Yeah.
So your request was a place on horseback in the front 10 of every major cavalry charge. This was your condition.
I had
to be an advisor?
I had two requests. I never see films. And then I love them. I can't come out of a cinema. I'm so fascinated by everything, even really bad films. So I bless them for that. I was asked to go to meet Oliver Stone. on Good Friday. Can you imagine? And I said, who is he, to one of my colleagues? And this American gentleman at lunch in the college dropped his knife and fork and said, you can't. He's Satan. Well, I have to say that Oliver is a genius. So up I went, and for 7 hours with a man I had never met, I had question the whole time. And he really knew the subject. Oh, yeah, okay. And then he stood on the staircase in the Covent Garden Hotel with my book in his hand and said, well, I have to, thank you, Robin, but I have to ask you, what do you want from the film? And he told me later he thought I would say $1 million, but he reckoned probably I'd have to have $500,000. But I don't want that. I'd lose it, or the bank would not change it or something. So I said, I have 2 non-negotiable demands, not one. I will ride in the first 10 of every cavalry charge involving Alexander, and I want my name in the credits preceded by the words, and introducing. Look, Stone has fought in wars. He is a complete genius. And he stood there absolutely amazed and said, I don't know if I can possibly do this. Okay, so we talked about it. He said, you cannot have and introducing on the film. We'll give you a frontline credit because of the rules with the unions. And can you ride? And I said, yeah, I'm six-legged. I was born a centaur. I live on horses. So I got a contract, to the horror of my agents, who said, how do we take 10% of a cavalry charge? You're not getting any money. And in the margin, Oliver had written and put his name in gold letters with the words, and introducing, on every cinema in Oxford. Oh, wonderful. And he went to interview Fidel Castro. Castro loves Alexander and later sent for me. He wanted to talk about him. Can you imagine what I've seen? Right. And from Cuba, Oliver sent me a postcard of black and white of the Cuban cavalry on horseback with their swords all drawn, and wrote on the back, Robin, thinking about it, I see you up there at the front. Bah. So then I had to do it. It's all very well to talk about it. God, that was another drama altogether. But then they couldn't believe that anyone actually would volunteer to do this. We had no stirrups, we had bareback and long lances, and the whole of the king's Moroccan cavalry. But I was saved by a great 4-legged friend, my chestnut racehorse they gave me, who was called, can you believe it, Gladiator. Anyway, they then said, we will give you a pre-screening in Oxford. So I didn't, because they all thought it was so extraordinary. So I thought we'd have, a trailer in the college, perhaps, for 20 minutes. No. They took the main cinema, and they told me to ask 500 people, which I did. And when I turned up, can you imagine? They're like children, too. They had pasted on the cinema long stickers with letters in gold saying, and introducing Robin Lane Fox. I will walk on water for them all. The film, here's what you must do. You will not believe it, and I didn't, but it's true. See the version now, the very long version, cut in 2014. That is the real film, and it is completely different. It has a break in the middle, and you come out thinking you have been hit on the head. We showed it in London last year, and at the end, the audience were in tears. There was dead silence, and then they all stood up. Stone was there, and 800 of them gave him a standing ovation. It's so powerful. I mean, obviously, it's not perfect, but you have to see it. So that's always in my mind. You'll never forget it. No.
Is it difficult to find the balance between historical accuracy and, in a way, meeting the public's expectations, what Alexander is like in their imaginary?
Oh, well, yeah, of course it is. But first of all, you must remember, we know for certain almost nothing Alexander ever said. A film has to have a script. Stone had, it's not mine, I was a consultant. I wasn't the author. He has his own view of him, a projection, I think, of Oliver's own very difficult childhood. It's not my view of him, but it's not impossible. We don't know. And it has to work as a film. But Stone would always use the analogy of Shakespeare. He said, look, Richard III, I don't like Richard III, but he does, is not history, but it's one of the greatest plays in the world. So that is my role model, he would say. But I wanted him always to be aware of what the real history is. Well, look, Ridley Scott, I know the poor woman who advised him on Gladiator and took such trouble, he just crumpled it up and put it in the waste paper basket. But I had one great advantage. Actually, I had two. The first was that I was going to lead the cavalry, so I had to be there. So every so often, Stone would say, what do we do now? And we would talk about it. And secondly, I met the divine Roxani, the wonderful Rosario Dawson. What can I say? The best. And she gave me the best review of my life. When the new long film came out, the New York Times asked her what was her view of it. She didn't wear any clothes in the film. She had an amazing figure. And she said to him, the reporter, look, there are three great things in this film. My right breast, Robin Lane Fox, and my left breast. And the man was amazed. Maybe you understand in English, and said, in that order. And she said, bless her forever. Yep, he'll never be demoted downwards, but he won't be promoted either. And I have a picture to prove it.
I'd like to dedicate at least a couple of minutes to...
I'm so sorry, I've talked too much.
No. That's why we're here, to listen to all you have to say. Which is this book, which is also translated into Spanish, The Classical World, an epic history of Greece and Rome. And the first question is, what does classic mean?
What a good question. Much disputed. What it means in Latin is first class. It's a label we put on particular periods of the ancient world. And the ancients, the Greeks in one case, the Romans in another, also look back on them as being what we might say first class. And the art, the drama, not Homer, and the plays, and the historical writing, and the philosophy, and the sheer power of reason in this very difficult time, always wars and fighting, I know all that, concentrates in the 5th century BC, which is the best, and also, amazingly, in the time between the death of Julius Caesar and the death, let's say, of the Emperor Augustus. So those are the two classical periods. My trick was that I took the Emperor Hadrian. This is why Spain was so kind to the book. He comes from near Cordoba. He was the emperor. And he too had an idea of a classical world in the past, focused on these particular times. So I wrote the book to explain more to Hadrian, the Spaniard, about the classical times that he also revered and idealized. Well, then you were very kind. I remained so honored, and I'm so grateful, because I wrote it. I had to pay off a very short-lived wife, and I had to have enough money to get rid of her, which I did. Right. And so I'm very grateful to you. But then I was rung up by El País, to my amazement, who said, you realize it's the end of July, and your book is the second top bestseller non-fiction in Spain. So I said, that's absolutely wonderful. And they said, we're ringing you because we want to ask you what you think of the top bestseller. And I said, well, okay, tell me what it is. And you will understand, all of you. They said, it's a book called 50 Sex Tips from Top Spanish Professionals. And I said, which is true, there is a better one in my book if you read it. So off Spain went to the beach in August, and what was the #1 bestseller? The Classical World, and all the men were looking through to try to find it. It's quite far on. You have to read carefully, but I can tell you it's worth it.
Is there, given the many famous figures and thinkers and artists in the classical world, is there a lesser known figure or story from this era that you find particularly intriguing and that you consider has not received the attention it deserves?
Any one story?
Story or person?
Well, I mean, you can't not. It has to be, especially in the world we see, in America and politically around us, the amazing events of the life of Cicero. Cicero is, at one level, always wrong, conceited, right-wing, and usually, like me, about 3 months behind what is really happening. But we have, for God's sake, we have his letters. Amazing, the personal letters that he wrote. And in them, you can follow this one man's watching the political changes that will lead to the awful events of the triumph of Caesar, the Civil War, and Caesar's murder. And I think it's when Cicero, in older age, is visited. For us, it's like Christmas for them. Caesar likes Cicero because he's so cultivated and learned. And he comes down to visit Cicero at Saturnalia, Christmas time. And they sit and they discuss together. But, you know, this is like someone far more powerful and urbane and brave and competent than Donald Trump, but he's the most powerful man in the world, talking to Cicero. And poor Cicero says, sed homines eramus, but we were just men. All they discuss is small points of literature. And Cicero is longing for Caesar to say, what do you think I should do about this? And would you like to go and help here? Nothing. And then he brings 2,000 people with him, Caesar, descending on poor Cicero. And off he rides. And Cicero ends this wonderful account of this letter and says, you ask me, would I invite him again? No. It's completely brilliant. And then only excelled by the amazing letters. Caesar is murdered. And Cicero has big hopes that the whole of the Republic will be revived. It's been dead for years, in a way. And the young adopted 18-year-old son, was he really adopted? Octavian, the most deadly teenager in the history of the world, lands in Italy and comes up through Italy and comes to call on old Cicero. Oh, Cicero's so excited. And he describes how he tells young Octavian what to do. I mean, Octavian knew exactly what to do, but Cicero was sure that Octavian was listening to it all. And he ends and says, I really think he will do everything I recommend. What a disaster, of course. Octavian does exactly the opposite and plays on being the heir of Caesar. This is so intense. And it's written with such wit, style, and right from the front line, never revised. And, well, what can you say? I mean, you are there. And if you don't like that, I just think you're moribund human beings. The Greeks invented politics. That's important. They invented citizenship. I really want to say this. We live now in a world of archaeologists, very good, but they don't have ease with the languages. And some of them write books implying that the Greeks in the time of Homer were just one little people in the middle of the Mediterranean, and the Phoenicians were in Spain, and there were the wonderful Egyptians, and of course the amazing buildings of Babylon and Assyria. And the only reason that we focus on the Greeks is because a group of usually men, white men, idealized these Greeks as being the roots of something called Western civilization. They're only one in the crowd. What drivel. There's no Homer. We don't know what the Phoenicians sang, but they didn't have Homer, and there's no trace of a Homer anywhere in Babylon or in Egypt with the level of sophistication and power this poem has. You can't judge the Greek world by the remains of some broken teacups and bits of pottery all the archaeologists can find, or jewelry. They're not particularly distinguished. But what you can judge them by is the poems they loved and really wanted to listen to. And then people say, oh, well, you know, all civilizations merged together and they all owe debts to one another. And a theory begins that I really don't share, that Homer listened to the poems in the languages of, say, the Babylonians or the Syrians or whatever, and was inspired by them. Nonsense. No way. And I would say very firmly, the Greeks invented politics. They invented citizenship. There's no idea of this in Phoenician Spain. There's no idea of this in Egypt or in Babylon. They invented the theater. They invented democracy. They invented tragedy. They invented comedy. They invented the idealized sculpting of, first of all, the naked male form. In India, you have these ridiculous demons with enormous breasts and tight waists. They're not idealized representations. They're scary divinities. They're very different. All of this is superbly done. The figures have an inner contemplation that is like a moment frozen in time. You see none of this. They invented theoretical mathematics. That's disputed, but I believe it. They probably invent formal logic. India is nearly there, but they never write a text about it. You have to infer it. They invent theoretical astronomy, not just observing the heavens like the Babylonians, but trying to explain what's going on. They invent theoretical natural medicine. You know, the Egyptians were brilliant don't get me wrong, as doctors treating people. The Greeks and they had no idea really what to do. But my great friend who studies Egyptian medicine says the Egyptians believed it went back either all to a god illness or to your backside, your bottom. Well, it doesn't. They were just missed it all. And the Greeks have an idea of internal balance and so on. That's totally different. The Greeks invent the idea of nature. I don't want to, and also, the Greeks invent celebrities. Tell me one celeb known to us by name, it may be a disastrous invention, who had the equivalent of the red carpet in Phoenician Spain, in Egypt, or Babylon, let alone India. There aren't any. And I really stand out against this. It's not some strained invention which I was given at school in order to make me feel special because money was being spent on me and I was born into the upper class. It's true. And that is the world we come from. And from the Greek example in art, politics, and so on, come what we think of as, inverted commas, Western or other societies working in that idiom. Without them, none. Museums would be full of monsters and stuff like you see in, I don't know, Cambodia. People love it, but you can't persuade me, you know, sort of monsters eating each other in cluttered sculpture with no sense of space. There would be no tragedy. There'd be nothing. You wouldn't go to the theater. And I think, of course, you might never go to the films. What is on the wall of George Lucas's film studio in Hollywood? Brilliant. Plato. Plato is an amazing figure who can think of anything. And I look at you now and I think of his simile of life in the cave. He asks, Socrates asks us to imagine that we are sitting in a cave and we are fixed so we can only look at the wall in front. And there is a fire lit and the flames are flickering and there is light. We can't turn around. And behind us, people are walking, carrying imitations of objects in the real world. So onto the wall, imagine thinking of this, we see being represented shimmering dogs, horses, people. This is special effects in the movies. Plato's invented it, for God's sake. And Lucas, I talked to him, said, no, it's very important to him. And he thought if you light from behind, people slowly carrying inch by inch items, and you light them and make them continuous, you can make a special effect cartoon film. Well, that's just one example. It's not always so well known. So it's not, I haven't given my life to some fraud, some kind of Western invention by men who happen to have testicles and should have been castrated. There's no question of that.
We have a few minutes left, and I wanted to speak about a part of your work that is perhaps lesser known than your works on the classic, which is your works on Christianity, pagans and Christians, the unauthorized version of the Bible, and the latest, this work on Augustine.
My best book, maybe.
So, obviously we don't have time to get into much detail, but since we're speaking about the classical world, is there continuity, in your opinion, between the Roman world and the Christian world? I mean,
well, of course, because the Christians are part of it, and it's very hard to define it. I didn't want to write on real Roman history and work in detail on it, but I have to say, going back to my school days, I had studied the Bible in Greek and all the books of the Bible, and I realized that the spread and success of Christianity should never be taken for granted. I had a book called The History of the Church, which began, the spread and triumph of the church can only be attributed to the will of God. Well, come on. I thought I can do better than that. And the difference between the outlook of a Christian and of a pagan and their relations one with the other is something, my second major area, along with the Greek world in particular, that fascinates me. It's the biggest change. And also, we're still living with it. Yeah.
And what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions people have today about the relationship between Christians and pagans?
Very interesting. One is that the Romans mercilessly persecuted every Christian in sight who went into hiding underground and somehow survived miraculously. No. Persecution was random, not very big, and eventually people living with Christians, as you might feel, I'm sure, in Madrid, well, they're harmless. We'll protect them from the authorities. So there was no way the Romans persecuted the Christians almost to extinction. I was taught by a great Marxist atheist, and I said to him, what do you think of the persecution of the Christians by the Romans? And he replied with a grim smile, too little and too late. That's one problem. And the second is that you can, like talking about Americans, there are many, many, many Americans. I never like it when people say, oh, I hate the Americans. Of course you don't. There are some wonderful people all over in all walks of life. There's great variety in the early Christians. And there are so many Christians who are not perfect Christians. And they have respected the Christian religion. But in so many areas of their life, they don't really differ from the unchristian behavior of pagans. And I always want to bring out the diversity, which has now become very popular, I'm pleased to say. So those would be two big misconceptions. And the third is that when the Emperor Constantine converts in 312 to support the Christian God, already there was a big tide, it was inevitable. Christians had won. No, it was a tiny minority. It was the biggest shock. I mean, you know, Spanish news channels never recovered. And why did it happen? He saw a vision in the sky and thought that God was promising him victory, which he then won. And in his personal entourage was the most important Spaniard in all ancient history, including Hadrian, Osios, Bishop of Cordova, who taught him, but of course, sir, what you saw was the Christian cross, didn't you? Oh, well, maybe, said Constantine. Then you must understand that it's the God of the Christians and so on. This was so important. Osios worked on him to interpret what he saw in a Christian way. And he put money behind it and all his support behind it. Christians were still a minority. I think a very small minority. Well, it was amazing, you know, suddenly as if the whole of Spain were to be made compulsorily vegetarian. Well, maybe, I don't know, maybe a lot of you are now, but in my youth you certainly weren't. So there are many misconceptions, and it's limitless.
What changes, in the more profound sense of the word, happen between a culture that worships multiple gods?
Yeah.
And a culture that worships a single god?
Yeah, the big problem is the problem of evil. In Homer's poems, there's no problem. dreadful things happen to us. And it's so terrible to read. I use the phrase in English, ruthless poignancy, for my last chapter. The terrible irony that we follow through Homer the plans and speeches of the gods, but on earth the heroes do not know what is going to happen to them. And this terrible gap between what the gods are planning and what frail mortals are thinking will happen. So when things go wrong, there's no difficulty. Homeric man thinks, well, maybe Athena and Hera are cross with our city and they've destroyed it. There was a quarrel we don't know in heaven. That's what happened. Or maybe they decided that they wanted to favor one person and destroy the rest of us. Polytheism has no problems in explaining misfortune. The gods are always fighting amongst themselves, and essentially, they don't really care about us. We're fun, but we're not the heart of their lives. But the big problem for everybody, with all the subtle answers of the Catholic Church and everyone who's so subtle, is why do innocent, good people suffer? I had a wonderful grandmother. When I went up to Oxford, she said to me, why ever do you want to do that? Do you want to be a professor or something frightful? Marvelous, I never forget her. And she was the most charitable, good, and selfless person who single-handedly looked after her daughter until she was herself 80, because she had a daughter who had acute polio and was pinned on a board. She lost another daughter who killed herself. She nearly lost another daughter whose husband had been shot in the war, and this daughter then had a breakdown and never really recovered. And she lost her husband very early. All this went wrong for my grandmother, who was, if she were here, you would see she's so much nicer than me, and she's a wonderful person. Why? Well, Catholics will say, oh, well, she was just being tested for her life of bliss in the next world. What rubbish. That's evasion. If you have one God, how do you explain the persistent visiting of random evil on somebody else? If she was a Homeric woman, my grandmother would have no difficulty. It was the anger of Hera with her. Or Athena and Hera were fighting and had decided to be cruel to her. That's what happens. That is one of the big advantages of having many gods.
I think we have time for perhaps discussing briefly why you decided to take on the Bible.
Because I've loved it all my life. I wrote in the beginning, I do not believe in God, I believe in the Bible. And why do I believe in it? I love it. It is not the word of God, for heaven's sakes. It is a wonderful monument to human wickedness. The authors lie about their identity. They all claim wildly rhetorical views of what we should do, trying to pretend that they're God's views, whereas they aren't. A lot of it is wrong, and it is completely unmissable, and the stories are wonderful. So I wanted to answer the mood at the time that Scripture is the Word of God, a very English view, an American view, that the Bible is historically true. Of course it isn't. But I also wanted to say there is so much truth in the Bible, but it is human truth. And that book has remained, I'm pleased to say, widely read. I really wrote from the heart. It's my most popular one, not so scholarly, I think I'd say. I'm also very proud that in the library in Oxford, an evangelical who was so appalled has left a chained reply to it, line by line, all of it nonsense, and says that if anyone borrows my book, they must be shown his refutation of it first, because he's so scared of it. I don't think they ever look at it. So that is an important book to me, yeah.
Was it difficult not speaking Aramaic or Hebrew to
Sorry?
Not because you speak Greek and you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
read
no,
Greek,
sure.
but
I
not
don't know
Aramaic and Hebrew.
No, I say all this.
Did you find this very challenging?
I have to say I know Arabic, so I know some Semitic language, so I'm not completely lost. And it was a popular, general book. I mean, it was meant to be serious but accessible, and it's been a big success. It wasn't difficult, no, not really. Perhaps it should have been more difficult. But of course, with the Greek in the whole of the New Testament, I was on my home ground. And I find this quite extraordinary. We have religion everywhere. The Pope, can the Pope read what St. Paul wrote? No, he can't. It's Greek, he doesn't know any. So why not teach it compulsorily to people? Oh no, it's too difficult. We teach them about changing sex and gender studies, or I don't know. It's so decadent, and I hope that Spain will reverse it.
Well, we will certainly try. Well, Robert Ling Fox, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here with us tonight.
Well, thank you all so much. Sorry, I speak old-fashioned English, and when you ask me, I'm now old, I see it so clearly in front of me. And I speak too fast, and most of you can't follow. And you've been so polite, and only one of you has had to go home. I'm so grateful.
Thank you.